On April 1st, 1988, an 8-year-old girl who was playing outside with two of her friends, moving between houses, remembered she had left her umbrella behind and turned back home alone to get it. She was never seen again. The police were informed, and they threw everything they had at finding her. 250 Fort Wayne officers and 50 volunteers combed the area within hours of her disappearance. Investigators sent DNA samples from 5 different suspects off for testing. Over the next 30 years, more than 700 names would land on the suspect list, and detectives would keep fielding new tips almost every single week, year after year, without fail. But somewhere out there, the man responsible wasn't just hiding from the police. He was taunting them, writing letters to them and the grieving family, and also sending threatening letters to other young girls, ultimately taunting the public with what he had done. Early on, a man who matched a witness description was pulled in and questioned for hours, but the only charges that stuck against him were for a completely different crime, and he walked free within weeks. 2 years later, when a chilling message turned up scrawled on the side of a barn, tied directly to the case, it should have cracked the whole thing open. Instead, it went nowhere, and investigators watched their strongest lead in years go cold in their hands. The case sat cold for decades in the police department, with the victim's family gradually losing hope of ever bringing their little girl's killer to justice. However, the police never gave up on their search for the audacious killer who taunted and haunted them for years. It would take 30 years before anyone was finally made to answer for what happened to that little girl. This is the story of 8-year-old April Tinsley, and the 30-year wait for the justice her family never once stopped fighting for. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of case this channel was built for. The ones that sat cold for decades and felt like they'd never be solved, until, against every expectation, they finally were. If that's the kind of story you enjoy, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. But before any of that, the search, the taunts, the 30 years of silence, the story has to start with who April Tinsley actually was. April Marie Tinsley was born on March 18, 1980, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. By the spring of 1988, she was 8 years old, a second grader at Fairfield Elementary School, and a member of the children's choir at Faith United Methodist Church. She had a twin brother, and she loved the colors blue, purple, and pink so much that people who knew her would remember it decades later. To everyone who knew her, she was described the same simple way. A sweet, ordinary little girl, living an ordinary little life in an ordinary Fort Wayne neighborhood. Nobody around her had any reason to think anything was wrong. That's what made what came next so hard to see coming. April 1st, 1988, was Good Friday. After school let out early that day, April asked her mother, Janet, if she could go play at her friend Nicole's house. Janet said yes, on one condition. April had to call as soon as she got there. She did. Janet expected her home by around 4 o'clock, because the sky was already turning gray, and rain looked like it was coming. April and Nicole ended up at a nearby park instead, playing together like they always did. But around 3 o'clock, Nicole left to go meet another friend, and April was left there alone. As the first drops of rain started to fall, April remembered something. She'd left her umbrella back at Nicole's house. So she turned around and started walking back to get it. She never made it. A witness would later come forward and say she'd seen a young girl matching April's description walking along the road that afternoon when a blue pickup truck pulled up beside her. Someone inside spoke to her. And according to the witness, April didn't look scared. She didn't look uncomfortable at all. Whoever was in that truck, it seemed, was not a total stranger to her. That single detail would haunt the investigation for years. 4 o'clock came and went, and April wasn't home. Janet called Nicole's mother, who explained that the girls had split up at the park almost an hour earlier. Panic set in fast. Janet and her husband searched the neighborhood themselves before finally calling the police, close to 6 o'clock that evening. Janet gave officers every detail she could think of, right down to exactly what April had been wearing. Within hours, the search had grown into something enormous. 250 Fort Wayne police officers and 50 volunteers spread out across the area, on foot and in vehicles, searching through the night and into the next day. As the hours dragged on with no sign of her, investigators began to fear the worst. April hadn't wandered off. She had been taken. The witness who saw the blue pickup truck gave police a description of the man behind the wheel. White, in his 30s, light brown hair, stubble on his face. Investigators worked with her to build a composite sketch and released it to the public, hoping someone, somewhere, would recognize him. More than 140 calls poured in from people who thought they recognized the man in the drawing. Not one of them led anywhere. 3 days later, on April 4th, 1988, while the search for April was still underway, a man out for his regular afternoon jog near Spencerville, Indiana, about 20 miles from Fort Wayne, spotted something in a ditch just off the side of the road. It was April. Investigators found one of her shoes nearby, tucked inside a shopping bag, along with something deeply disturbing left beside her body, a sex toy, placed there deliberately. Her other shoe turned up later, roughly 800 feet away on the opposite side of the road. She was fully clothed when she was found, but the autopsy would soon reveal that she had been redressed after the attack. The findings were devastating. April had been raped and then strangled to death. She had likely died 1 to 2 days before she was found, but her body had only been in that ditch for about 4 hours. That meant whoever killed her had kept her somewhere else first, then driven her out to a public roadside and dumped her there in broad daylight, in the middle of the same search that was still actively looking for her. It was a reckless, almost arrogant thing to do. To investigators, it suggested something chilling. Whoever did this wasn't afraid of being seen. He probably knew this area extremely well. Fort Wayne was devastated. 2 local radio stations set up a reward fund within a day of the discovery, and more donations poured in to help the Tinsley family cover funeral costs. April's memorial service was held on April 8, 1988, at the same church where she used to sing in the children's choir. She was laid to rest at Green Lawn Memorial Park. Her killer was still out there, and for the moment, police had almost nothing to go on. Just days after the discovery, police announced an arrest. A 34-year-old man bore a strong resemblance to the composite sketch, so strong that 140 separate tipsters had called it in. A neighbor confirmed seeing a blue van parked outside his house on multiple occasions. He'd even told friends he had inside knowledge about April's death. For a moment, it looked like the case might be over almost as soon as it began. But when police brought him in and questioned him for hours, they didn't charge him with April's murder. Instead, he was charged in a completely unrelated case, the molestation of an 11-year-old girl. A month later, he was acquitted of even that. Hair and blood samples from him, along with 5 other men questioned in connection with April's case, were sent off to a private lab in Maryland for testing. When the results finally came back in August of 1988, every single one of the 6 samples was inconclusive. In 1988, DNA science simply wasn't advanced enough to give investigators the answers they needed. Around the same time, another name surfaced, a local gang member known by the nickname Moose. He resembled the sketch, had a documented history of bothering children at local parks with inappropriate comments, and had access to a blue truck, even though he didn't personally own one. What worried the Tinsleys most was that Moose was rumored to belong to a gang that dabbled in occult practices. He remained a serious suspect for several weeks, but without hard evidence tying him directly to the crime, police eventually had to move on. Weeks after April's death, 90 members of the Fort Wayne community came together and formed a volunteer group they called April, dedicated to helping police handle future cases involving missing and exploited children. It was a small, hopeful thing to come out of an unimaginable tragedy, but April's own case remained unsolved. 2 years passed, no arrest, no new leads. Then, on May 21, 1990, something turned up that changed everything. For a moment, anyway. Someone discovered a message, scrawled in crayon, on the side of a barn in St. Joseph Township, not far from where April's body had been found. The message openly bragged about killing an 8-year-old girl named April. It taunted police directly, asking whether they'd ever found her other shoe, and it ended with a threat that whoever wrote it would kill again. That single detail, the other shoe, is what made investigators' blood run cold. The location of that second shoe, found hundreds of feet from the crime scene, had never been released to the public. Whoever wrote that message either committed the murder himself or knew details that only the killer or the police could have known. A witness who lived near the barn told investigators he'd seen a man return to the area multiple times, and that each time the message had grown more visible. Still, despite having an eyewitness, no arrest followed. Then, just weeks later, a second horror struck Fort Wayne. 7-year-old Sarah Jean Bowker was found dead on June 14, 1990. The timing, the age of the victim, the location, all of it was close enough to raise a terrifying question. Was the same man responsible for both girls? Local and state police formed a joint homicide team in April of 1991 to investigate the two cases together, hoping that combining resources might finally break things open. By August of 1991, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit delivered their conclusion. Despite the similarities, the two cases were not connected. It was a strange kind of relief and disappointment at the same time. April's case was exactly where it had started, cold and completely alone. For the next 14 years, there was nothing. No notes, no leads, no arrests, just silence. Then, over Memorial Day weekend in 2004, the silence broke, and in the most disturbing way imaginable. 4 notes turned up scattered around the Fort Wayne area. 1 was left in a mailbox. 3 others were tucked into bags left on bicycles that belonged to young girls, parked outside their own homes. Inside those bags, alongside the notes, were used condoms and nude Polaroid photographs showing the lower half of a man's body. The notes were addressed directly to the girls who found them. Whoever wrote them claimed to have been watching each child. He identified himself as the same person who had kidnapped, raped, and killed April Tinsley 16 years earlier. He told each girl she was his next victim, and he threatened violence against her family's home if she told police, or if the note wasn't made public in the news. This wasn't a killer bragging about the past anymore. This was a direct, personal threat against living children, right now, in the present. When investigators tested the DNA on the used condoms, it matched the suspect profile they'd already built from the original 1988 crime scene evidence. That confirmed it. This wasn't a copycat, and it wasn't some sick prank. The same man who killed April Tinsley 16 years earlier was still out there, still watching children in the same community. There was just one enormous problem. They finally had DNA they could trust completely. But it matched no one in any criminal database in the country. They had a profile. They didn't have a name. Witnesses reported seeing a forest green van or pickup truck cruising through the affected neighborhoods around the time the notes were believed to have been dropped off. It was one more piece of the puzzle, but still not enough. Among the flood of tips that came pouring in after the notes went public, one call in particular stood out. A man phoned police and said he believed his own father was April's killer. His reasoning wasn't nothing. His father lived close to where April had been taken. He had a documented history of child molestation. He was known to use certain odd phrases that echoed language from the notes. And he had owned a blue truck for years, one he'd had repainted right around the time April disappeared. Investigators brought the man in for questioning. He denied ever meeting April and claimed he'd been at work both on the day she disappeared and the day her body was found. It should have been an easy alibi to confirm. Instead, when police followed up with his employer, they learned he hadn't been scheduled to work on either day. It was exactly the kind of inconsistency that made investigators' pulse quicken. For a moment, it looked like they might finally have their man. Then his DNA came back. It didn't match. He was cleared, and his name was never made public. It was yet another door that had swung wide open with hope, only to slam shut just as fast. On June 24, 2005, the Tinsley family stood outside the Allen County Courthouse and publicly begged for any information that might finally bring them answers. Among the people who heard that call was a Fort Wayne neighborhood resident named Tom Goings. He had no personal connection to April. He'd never even met her. But she was a child from his own neighborhood, close in age to his own nieces, and the crime struck him somewhere he couldn't shake. Starting around 2004, without any badge, paycheck, or official authority, Tom made it his personal mission to help find April's killer. He printed and distributed thousands of flyers, often in rough, dangerous parts of the city where he suspected the killer might be hiding. He went undercover, deliberately building relationships with unsavory characters, just to quietly determine whether any of them might be connected to the crime. A decision that once got him physically assaulted at a gas station by someone who didn't appreciate the attention he was bringing to men like himself. He organized prayer vigils, press conferences, and balloon releases, all designed to keep April's name and face in front of the public. Every single tip he gathered, he handed straight over to police. His relentless campaign helped push April's story onto national television, and the renewed attention eventually forced the case back onto police radar as an active investigation, not just a dusty file in a cabinet. It was Tom who later approached his neighborhood association with the idea to build a small garden in April's memory. The community came together, donating land, plants, and materials. Tom built and maintained it almost entirely himself, eventually adding a small free library box for the neighborhood's children to use, because, as he saw it, April would always only be 8 years old and would never get the chance to grow up and give back the way this small library now could, in her name. Behind the scenes, one ordinary man had quietly refused to let April Tinsley become a forgotten statistic. In June of 2009, authorities formally asked the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Task Force for help. The Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit built a detailed psychological profile of the man they were hunting, describing him as someone with a long-term, persistent sexual attraction specifically to young children, not a one-time impulse, but an ongoing, deeply rooted pattern. According to the profile, they were likely looking for a white male, then believed to be somewhere in his 40s or 50s, probably living or working in the northeast section of Fort Wayne or Allen County, likely earning a low to medium income. Investigators believed he was physically circumcised and had noticeable hair on his lower legs. Around 2004, he may have owned or borrowed a Polaroid camera, and possibly a forest green pickup truck fitted with a camper shell and dark-tinted windows. That same year, the television show America's Most Wanted aired a segment on April's case. It generated more tip calls than any other story the show had featured that particular night. In 2012, the show returned for a follow-up episode, during which police revealed one more oddly specific detail from the original crime scene: the unusual sex toy left in a Sears shopping bag near April's body. They were hoping someone, somewhere, would recognize it. Once again, the tips came pouring in, and once again, none of them cracked the case. In June of 2015, a company called Parabon Nanolabs used a new technique to generate something investigators had never had before: a composite image of the suspect's face, built directly from his own DNA, rather than a witness's memory, then digitally aged to estimate what he might look like decades later. Police released an updated version of that image the following year. Crime Watch Daily featured April's story in a 2016 episode as well. The case was more publicly visible than it had been in years, and still, no name. By 2015, the Hoagland Masterson neighborhood in Fort Wayne had begun construction on April's garden, the memorial Tom Goings had first proposed. It was officially dedicated on August 16, 2015, complete with memorial bricks bearing the names of April's own deceased family members alongside those of other community members who had lost loved ones. On April 4, 2018, 30 years, almost to the day since her murder, April's mother Janet organized a balloon launch at the garden. It was meant to honor not just April, but every child lost to violence. The balloons released that day were blue, purple, and pink. These were April's favorite colors. Janet spoke publicly that day about what 30 years of uncertainty had felt like. The constant not knowing whether investigators were still working the case, whether there were any new leads at all, whether this would simply never be solved. The very next day, Fairfield Elementary School, April's own school, dedicated a bench and a pink magnolia tree in her memory, followed by a candlelight vigil. Later that summer, on July 28, 2018, the community held a memorial walk that began at April's garden. Around this same time, a Fort Wayne homicide detective revealed something that might surprise people who assumed the case had simply been forgotten. The cold case unit was still receiving roughly half a dozen new tips a week, even 3 decades later. Across the life of the investigation, nearly 700 different names had crossed their suspect list. The case had never actually gone dormant. It had simply gone unsolved. That was about to change, and faster than anyone expected. In May of 2018, just about 2 weeks after investigators in California used a brand new forensic technique to finally identify the infamous Golden State Killer, a Fort Wayne police detective named Brian Martin decided to try the same method on April's case. He sent the department's crime scene DNA sample to Parabon Nanolabs, a forensic DNA company based in Virginia, for what's called genetic genealogy testing. This technique worked differently than a standard DNA database search. Instead of only checking for a direct match against known criminals, it compared the crime scene DNA against genetic profiles that ordinary people had voluntarily uploaded to public genealogy websites while researching their own family trees. From there, genealogists could work outward, cousin by cousin, branch by branch, until the family tree narrowed down toward a single, specific suspect. A genetic genealogist named C.C. Moore took on the case. Working through an enormous web of distant relatives, she managed to narrow the entire search down to just 2 brothers by July 2, 2018. One of them was 59-year-old John D. Miller, living in a trailer park in the small town of Grabille, Indiana, just 15 miles from Fort Wayne. It was the same small town where 2 of the threatening 2004 notes had been left, all those years earlier. When investigators quietly asked around Miller's neighborhood, the picture that emerged was unsettling. Neighbors described him as deeply reclusive and often angry. He ate at the same local restaurant almost every single day. If anyone tried to say hello, he would only grunt back, never speaking. To confirm they had the right brother without tipping him off, detectives went through Miller's household garbage and recovered several used condoms. When the DNA on them was tested, it matched the profile investigators had been chasing for 30 years. After 3 decades, they finally had a name. On July 15, 2018, detectives went to Miller's home and asked him to come with them to the police station to talk. After reading him his rights, an investigator asked if he had any idea why they wanted to speak with him. He didn't hesitate. He answered with 2 words, April Tinsley.
Do you have any idea what we need to talk to you about?
I think probably the Tinsley case. That's the only one I can think of. DNA.
Yeah. We have DNA. When we did that DNA, we were able to narrow it down to you. You've already admitted to this by the letters and the condoms that you left for us. What'd she say when you grabbed her?
She said, don't hurt me, I'll do whatever you say.
At the station, Miller confessed. He told investigators he had planned to abduct a child that day, but he hadn't picked out April specifically ahead of time. He said he'd essentially grabbed her at random after asking her to get into his car. He drove her back to his trailer, where he violated her and then strangled her to death with his bare hands. He admitted to further violating her body after her death, before finally waiting until nightfall to drive her out to the ditch where a jogger would find her 3 days later. 30 years of silence, false leads, taunting notes, and heartbreak. And it ended with 2 words spoken quietly in a police interview room. Miller was formally charged with murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. He pleaded not guilty at a court hearing on July 19, 2018. Then, on December 7, 2018, he changed his plea. In court, he admitted once again that he had raped April Tinsley and strangled her with his bare hands. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison, 50 years for murder, and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence brought outrage in some corners of the Fort Wayne community, since Indiana law meant the death penalty was never on the table for a crime charged this many years after the fact. Still, given Miller's age, few people expected him to survive anywhere near the full length of his sentence anyway. After sentencing, Miller was first held at a reception center in Plainfield, Indiana, before being transferred on January 16, 2019, to the Newcastle Correctional Facility. His earliest theoretical release date was set for July 15, 2058, when he would have been 99 years old. In May of 2019, 9 investigators from the Fort Wayne Police Department, the Indiana State Police, the FBI, and the Allen County Sheriff's Department were jointly honored with a National Policing Award, recognizing more than 30 years of collaborative work across multiple agencies to finally bring April's killer to justice. Months earlier, in October of 2018, 3 Fort Wayne investigators had also been separately honored by Indiana State Police for their specific role in identifying Miller. The Tinsley family had paid a steep price long before any of this closure arrived. Back in 1991, relentless media attention, reporters and camera crews camped outside their home for years, eventually drove them to leave Fort Wayne altogether. They only returned to the community years later, around the time April's garden was being built. That garden still stands today in the Hoagland Masterson neighborhood, green, quiet, filled with flowers, benches, and a small free library where local children can still pick up a book. Tom Goings, the ordinary neighbor who refused for over a decade to let April's case fade into forgotten history, kept tending it, just as he'd promised her he would, long before he ever knew whether that promise would be kept. As for John Miller, he never came close to his scheduled 2058 release date. He died of natural causes in September of 2025 at a hospital in Indianapolis, having spent the rest of his life exactly where the 30-year search for April Tinsley's killer had finally put him. It took 30 years. It took a jogger's grim discovery, a witness's fragile memory, a barn wall scrawled with crayon, threatening notes left on children's bicycles, a false lead that nearly broke a family's heart all over again, an ordinary neighbor who refused to stop searching, and finally, a genetic genealogy database originally built for people tracing their own family history, not for catching killers. But in the end, all of it came together. April Tinsley got the answer her family had waited 3 decades to hear. If you enjoy watching cold cases get solved, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories just like this one.